Here's a framework for thinking about 6 of the most common study designs used in analytic epidemiology. The 6 designs fall into 2 main categories: experimental and observational or non-experimental. The one question that you can use to distinguish the 2 categories is this: did the investigator assign the exposure? For example, in a study of coffee, the exposure, and stomach ulcers, the outcome, did the investigator get a study sample together and decide which of them would get coffee and which wouldn't? If the investigator assigned exposure, then we'd say it's an experimental study design. On the other hand, if the investigator got a study sample together and then figured out which of them drink coffee and which don't, that is, the investigator didn't assign them to be exposed or not, then we'd say it's observational or a non-experimental study design. Let's talk about experimental studies. There are 2 main designs, and the question that you can use to distinguish between these 2 is this: was the exposure randomly assigned? Let's say you're conducting an experimental study of coffee and stomach ulcers among the students in CNEAS 298. If you randomly assign participants to either the intervention coffee group or to the control no coffee group, then you are conducting a true experimental study, also called a randomized controlled trial. And you're using what's considered the gold standard of research designs. But sometimes it's not feasible to randomly assign people. Let's say you have one big container of coffee and one big container of not coffee. For the sake of efficiency, you set the container of coffee at the front of the room so that everyone in the front half of the class is in the intervention group. And you set the container of not coffee in the back so that everyone in the back is in the control group. This is a quasi-experimental study because you have not randomly assigned participants to one group or the other. Now let's move on to observational study designs. The primary feature that distinguishes these studies is directionality, which has to do with when exposure and outcome information is collected. In one kind of study, you recruit a sample of participants and ask them about their exposure, coffee consumption, at what we call baseline. This is important. The participants must not have stomach ulcers at baseline to be in the study, because then you'll follow them forward in time, prospectively, and say, a year later, see which, if any of them, developed stomach ulcers. So in this kind of study, exposure information is collected first, and outcome information is collected later. This study design has a few names: prospective cohort, longitudinal cohort, or simply follow-up. In a second kind of study, you recruit 2 different samples of participants. One sample with the outcome you're interested in, the cases, in this case, people with stomach ulcers, and one sample without the outcome, or the controls, in this case, people who don't have stomach ulcers. Then you'd ask them about their exposure in the past. So in this kind of study, disease information is collected first, and exposure information is collected next, in a retrospective way, because you're asking people to remember something from the past. This kind of study is called a case control study. In a third kind of study, you recruit a sample of participants and ask them about their exposure and their outcome at the same time. Since you're doing it all at the same time, and it's like a snapshot of things, this is called a cross-sectional design. So we've talked about 3 of the 4 observational study designs. The fourth and last one, the ecologic design, also collects exposure and outcome data at the same time, but its focus is on populations, not individuals. For this, we're going to leave behind coffee and ulcers for a real example. So now you're looking at population-level exposure and population-level outcome data, and looking at their association across populations, or over time. Ecologic evidence is very compelling, but ecologic studies are generally considered the weakest of the 6 designs because it's hard to rule out alternative explanations. So there are our 6 main study designs in analytic epidemiology. Our next step will be to think about what makes one design stronger than another in terms of making causal inferences.